Hello everyone, my name is James and today I'm going to be building this tapering jig. If this is something you'd like to make, I will put a link to all of the parts in the description. First, I'd like to say thank you to all of you who support our channel on Patreon. And also to everyone who sees the things that I build, sees the links to those items in my description and purchases through those links. That goes to help support our channel as well. Okay, so for this build I am using a piece of 1/2 inch thick Baltic birch plywood. Regular plywood would work just fine. I just happen to have a few extra pieces of Baltic birch around, and it is a little bit flatter and a little bit harder and more dense than regular plywood. So the first thing I need to do is attach a miter bar to the bottom, and for this I really prefer aluminum. You can certainly cut one out of hardwood, but I like these because I don't have to worry about changes with expansion and contraction due to the weather, and these things are also adjustable, which is pretty nice. So I've got to mark the locations where the threaded points are in order to drill holes for the screws to go through and hold on to the miter bar. So I do want these holes the exact same diameter as the outer diameter of the threads for the screw that I'm putting through, or possibly a tiny bit bigger. Basically, I don't want the threads to have to thread through the wood at this point. And since I don't want these screw heads protruding through, I need to drill a little countersink in the top in order to get those things down flush. So if you have ever drilled one of these countersink holes by hand and you've noticed there's a little bit of a hexagonal shape to the hole, it's because the drill bit bounces around. If you hold the drill real steady or put the piece in a drill press, then it'll drill a perfectly round hole. So with that done, I like to do a little pre-assembly here and test it and make sure it works just right. If you've measured carefully before you put the holes in, then you shouldn't have any problems getting the screw threads to line up. And if you buy any one of these miter bars from Rockler or Woodcraft or even online from Amazon, they'll come with threaded sections in them. So it's pretty easy just to mark a hole in the middle and drill those holes. So when I installed my miter bar, I made sure that it was the right distance away from the blade so that I could cut a little bit of the board off. And this is perfect because this kind of gives me a zero clearance on this side and gives me kind of the exact edge of where my tapering jig is going to cut to. So now I've got to cut the slots out in order to have a place for the T-slot bolts to fit. These are what is going to hold down the adjustable guide for this tapering jig. And I've done this on my router table here. You could also do it with a handheld router. The first slot that I'm cutting is the wider slot that the T portion of the T-bolt will fit into and kind of be hidden from view. And then next I'm going to cut a thinner slot, like a 1/4 or a 5/16 inch slot, which will come all the way through for the bolt to protrude through and clamp onto the fence. And you can see there's the first of the 2 slots that's done. And here's the second slot that I'm cutting now. You notice I've stayed about 1 inch or 1.5 inches away from the edge. Obviously if I cut all the way through, I will cut my board in half and then it won't work properly. Here again I've got this set up on my router table, but it's just about as easy to do this with a handheld router. And you can take a look and see how the slot is now complete. There's a space for the T portion of the bolt to remain secured to, right there, and then the hole all the way through so that the threads can come through and grab a hold of the fence, and it's able to slide back and forth. And this piece is what I would call the fence of the tapering jig. This is the portion that's going to sit on top. Those bolts are going to bolt this down at whatever angle that we want. And we're going to be able to pivot this back and forth at various angles in order to achieve the right taper cut that we're looking for. And you can see we have the exact same slot system here. The bulk of the build is really done at this point, and so we just need to sand down all those rough edges on the plywood and smooth it up a little bit. So now that the build is done, I'm going to add a couple of features to make it work a little bit better. I'm cutting a few strips of 220 grit sandpaper to attach to the top of the tapering jig. I find that spray adhesive is a great way to attach these. I use 3M spray adhesive. It's very strong and it lasts forever. I just spray on a good coat of it. I let it dry for about 3 or 4 minutes and then I'll affix it to the board. So I have a square here so that I can line these up straight, just for looks really. It doesn't have to be straight. And what these are going to accomplish is when I set the board that I'm going to be tapering on top of this jig, I am going to clamp it down, but this really gives me a whole lot of friction against the bottom so that I need very little clamping pressure and the board isn't going to be able to slide around at all. This actually makes a really big difference. So I'm just going to go ahead and put the jig back together. It's just a single bar, so it's going to slide pretty good right away. But I do like to put a good coat of paste wax on the bottom and on the bar. There's my photo bomber and her older sister there. I like to get a good coat of paste wax going, and that's really going to make it slick. So we're not going to have any friction from the table. So I had a handle sitting around, so I thought I would go ahead and put this thing in, and there really probably wasn't any need to because I found out even after I put the handle in, I didn't use it, just like I didn't use it on my last tapering jig. But it's an option for somebody who might like it. Now it's time to put the tapering jig together, and I can show you a little bit about how it works. And a lot of people make these star knobs. I think mine might be Rockler brand, I'm not sure. You can get them from Rockler, Wood River, a lot of other independent people make them. I will put a link to a quality pair of inexpensive ones in the description. And you certainly don't have to use a star knob here. You can just use a washer and a wing nut. Those work just as well. But these are pretty cheap. I think you can end up getting them for about $1.50 a piece, or even less. So I go ahead and use them. Here I'm screwing a little piece of metal on the end. This is going to kind of act like a catch for me to hold the edge of the wood as I'm pushing the wood through. This could be a block of wood, a piece of metal with a couple holes in it, whatever you have. And these are the hold down clamps. Here again, these are Rockler. I actually have a lot of these hold down clamps hanging out in my shop. I've got Rockler brand, Woodpecker brand. These work great, and I'll show you an even cheaper alternative as well. Alright, so now it's actually completely done, and I'm going to show you a cut that I sometimes make in my shop, which is to cut a pretty wide angle on a piece of plywood. I'm just going to kind of arbitrarily choose one here. And this is something that's beyond the scope of any store-bought tapering jig because it's really just too wide. But it's very easy to get this exact cut on this tapering jig. We know that the edge of the tapering jig there is perfectly flush with the edge of my blade. So I hold my tapering jig up on edge and I'll set this board down on this side, I'll make sure my fence on my jig is a little bit loose so that I can wiggle it around. And then I'll just lower this thing into position while adjusting that, and I'll line it up perfectly. I can get that line now lined up exactly even with the edge of my tapering jig. And I'm actually going to go ahead and try and cut this line right in half. Once I have it lined up exactly where it needs to be and the fence has been secured down, I can go ahead and lower the tapering jig back down flat, and now I'll use the hold down clamps to hold the piece in place. And if you can notice there, I don't even have the piece slid all the way back to the metal catch that holds it. The friction is so tight on these that with hold down clamps, it holds just fine. So I'll pull the tapering jig out a ways from the edge of the saw. I'll raise the saw blade to the depth of cut that I'm looking for, and we'll give it a cut. And you can probably see there that I completely forgot I had a handle on my tapering jig. And now we take a look at it, and now that I'm looking at it on camera, I can barely see some of that line, but if you're here in person, you could see that it did cut the line in half. I probably should have made the line a little bit thicker. And now I'm going to do a cut that's more typical of what you might use a tapering jig for, and that is to taper a leg. So I've got a piece of 2x2 here. I put that in at an arbitrary taper. You could have a specific one in mind and mark and measure, and then set the tapering jig up on edge like I did and get it exact. But I'm just going to kind of roughly show you the cut of a taper on this leg. Now I'll just do the same thing. I'll pull the jig back out of the way of the blade, raise the blade up to the depth of cut that I need, and then go ahead and make the cut. And I didn't realize this until I got to this point, but once again I did not use that handle. So most legs for tables that are tapered on two sides, and that's pretty easy. With the tapering jig, you just unclamp those clamps, rotate it 90 degrees, clamp it back down, and cut the other side. So you can see why we put the slots all the way through the fence board, is so we can move those clamps up and down on the fence board as we need to. And there you have it, a pretty simple taper for a leg. I kind of wish I had a wider board in the shop, like a 3x3 or something, so I could show you a little more dramatic taper on it, but it works exactly the same. So when I cut the fence board for this tapering jig, I actually cut two identical ones. And the reason for that is so that I could stack them. By stacking them, this raises the level of my clamps up a little bit higher so that I can taper larger pieces like 3x3 or 4x4 and still get a really strong and secure clamp. So here maybe we'll take a quick look at some alternatives. I've used the Rockler star knobs and the Rockler hold down clamps. These are a pair of Woodpecker hold down clamps. And what I have done is just use a standard hex head bolt in there. Let me open it up just a little bit and I can show you. I think this is just a 3/16 inch hex head, which also fits in that slot perfectly. And these are even a little bit cheaper than the Rockler ones. These are the T-slot nuts you can buy with Rockler's stuff, or you can just buy them individually. And you could even get fancy with the hold down clamps and use something like these toggle clamps. All of those things work equally well. And here I was just going to show you, you don't even have to use any store-bought hold-down clamp at all. For many, many years, I never had those. I have a lot in my shop now, so that's why I put them together with this. But for a long time, I just used a piece of hardwood with another little piece of hardwood glued on the edge. And here's one that I've probably used for 5 years. It's just a piece of oak, and you can just put a nut or a wing nut and hold it down. This works 100% as good as the Rockler ones, and you can find something like that in your shop for free. And that's a wrap. Thanks for watching, everyone.